Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And as always, thank you so much for listening. This week, a very interesting conversation with one of our favorite guests, David Nicandri, talking about his new book on Captain Cook.
Oh, amazing. You know, he's been such a friend of mine and such a friend to you and such a friend of Jefferson Hour listeners. People write in and say, more Nicandri. This is his most recent book, Captain Cook Rediscovered, Voyaging to the Icy Latitudes, released in November of 2020 by the University of British Columbia Press, 434 pages. It's an account of the third and least understood, least written about voyage of the three great oceanic voyages of British Captain James Cook. And he never disappoints, does he?
No, Nicandri is a unique individual. It's always fun to talk to him and to listen to him talk about Captain Cook, of course. And he defends Captain Cook when necessary, but it's a fascinating story.
His courage is something that I find really remarkable, David, because if you think there's a lot written about Thomas Jefferson, or if you think there's a lot written about Lewis and Clark, it pales besides all that has been written about Captain James Cook. And the last chapter of this book, Captain Cook Rediscovered, looks at what might be called the postmodern reaction. And I think he quotes somebody who's saying, no historical figure's reputation has plummeted so far, so fast as that of James Cook. And so I admire Dave Nicandri for taking on a subject of this magnitude. This is writing about someone who is known by hundreds of thousands of people worldwide. And if you make a single mistake or take a single risk, there will be people who come rushing in from everywhere saying, oh no, because everyone has an ownership level with Cook that you wouldn't find with many other historical figures. And so I so admire the iconoclast David Nicandri for taking that on. And of course, he's such a great writer. You can hear it in the way that he talks about these things. He has a beautiful vocabulary and a kind of slightly odd way of talking, which is very compelling.
Yeah, it really is. I texted you a quote about a week ago that, what you just said made me recall that, talking about Cook and being viewed as an imperialist and a racist, and me saying who wasn't during that time. And then thinking about Jefferson too. The author Sixon Liu wrote, "Every era puts invisible shackles on those who have lived through it, and I can only dance in my chains. Every era puts invisible shackles on those who have lived through it."
Yeah, that's beautiful.
So before we go to the show, this great conversation with David Nicandri, I'm going to give you your Hamilton moment. I'll lead you in by saying we so appreciate those of you who have chosen to support the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We need your support to continue the show, and we have every intention of continuing the show. So those of you who have the means and would like to, go to jeffersonhour.com and click on donate. There's a number of different ways you can help support the Thomas Jefferson Hour. And sincerely, we really do appreciate that. And now it's your Hamilton moment, sir.
So many things are coming up. Thank you. So the Constitution online course, we're going to repeat. So if you're interested in doing Constitution 101, a non-credit online course on the flashpoints and the potential for amendment and reform in the United States Constitution. Then the 3 Locksaw Lodge winter retreats coming in mid-January, Walden and Thoreau for the first one, the life and work of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. And that one was so highly subscribed that we're doing a second section, I believe beginning on the 24th of January. This is this lodge just west of Missoula, Montana. So 1 4-day humanities retreat on Thoreau and Whitman, the second 2 on J. Robert Oppenheimer, the making of the atomic bomb and the decision to use the atomic bomb. And I'm reading for that now the great book American Prometheus, which won the Pulitzer Prize, an absolutely magnificent study of a tragic and really compelling figure, J. Robert Oppenheimer. And then, of course, the 2 summer trips, the annual Lewis and Clark trip, which is full, but people do drop out, so keep that in mind. And then a trip on the Salmon River, a Class 4 river, the River of No Return. That's in the summer. You can find out more detail about all of that at jeffersonhour.com, plus my books. Bring Out Your Dead is on Amazon Kindle. My new book, Repairing Jefferson's America, has been doing extremely well. My North Dakota book is still being cut down to size, but it'll be published early in the spring. So all of those things, David, are really important to me, especially now because my life has been pretty seriously grounded and disrupted by the pandemic. And so I'm writing more, and these online courses have proved to be something of extraordinary satisfaction to me, and I think to others.
Very good. And with that, shall we go to the show?
Indeed. All I can say is David Nicandri is such fun. So listen now to this special out-of-character edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, a conversation with Dave Nicandri about his just-published book, Captain Cook Rediscovered, Voyaging to the Icy Latitudes.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. I'm your host, David Swenson, joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and a very special guest, a returning guest. Would you care to introduce him, sir?
Good day to you, David, but we have another David on the line, our dear friend David L. Nicandri, who's our Enlightenment correspondent on the West Coast of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We always have him on when we're talking about Enlightenment subjects. You remember the great episode we had on the eclipse, and before that one on the transit of Venus. Today, I'm just thrilled to be able to say that David Nicandri has just released his book on Captain Cook. The title is Captain Cook Rediscovered, Voyaging to the Icy Latitudes. I mean, literally just off the press, University of British Columbia Press. Welcome, our dear friend, Dave Nicandri.
Good day to you both, citizens.
It's great to talk with you. We both have lots of questions for you, but let me start with a really easy one, and you may find it tedious, but it's important. For those of our listeners who don't really know this subject very well, give us James Cook 101, in the briefest summary. Who was he, what did he do, and why is he important?
Captain Cook led 3 grand voyages, principally to the Pacific Ocean, during the late Enlightenment. The first one from 1768 to 1771 was sent to Tahiti to view the transit of Venus, after which he defined the coastlines of New Zealand and Australia. On the second, from 1772 to 1775, Cook disproved the existence of what we now know as the mythical southern continent. It was supposed in that time that there was a landmass in the southern hemisphere that mirrored Eurasia in the northern hemisphere. And in the process of scouring the high latitudes of the Indian, Pacific, and Atlantic Oceans in that order, Cook, in effect, circumnavigated Antarctica, proving there was no mid-latitude or no high-latitude continent in the southern hemisphere, though there was in all likelihood one that was at the pole, and Cook was the first one to gain an intimation for Enlightenment science that there was a southern polar continent. And then finally, during his third and last voyage, 1776 to 1779, and he left, by the way, Plymouth, England, the week after the Declaration of Independence was signed. Cook sought to prove the existence of a Northwest Passage through or above North America, but he was the first since Francis Drake to search for it from the Pacific side of North America. He could not find the Northwest Passage at that time, though if he were to sail this year or next, he would be able to navigate his way through the northern Canadian archipelago. But in laying over for the winter of 1778-79 in Hawaii, an archipelago he discovered from the European vantage point on his way north in the spring of 1778, but laying over the winter of 1778-79 in anticipation of a second attempt at the Northwest Passage, he was killed, and at that point achieved virtually legendary status in the history of exploration. That, I think, is a good Cook 101 summary.
British born, old style, October 27th, 1728, so 15 years older than Thomas Jefferson. 3 voyages, probably the most traveled man of his age, or almost any age, killed on the 3rd voyage in Hawaii in 1779. Again, before we get to the substance of your book, what does this have to do with Thomas Jefferson?
Cook and Jefferson were both paragons of what I'll call the Enlightenment sensibility, although I have some trouble with that word because sensibility actually evokes kind of the ethos of the Romantic era, which succeeded the Enlightenment. The key feature of the Enlightenment was kind of a dispassionate, empirical outlook on the world to try to define its physical processes, its anthropological makeup. Scientific discovery was where Cook and Jefferson overlapped. Jefferson, of course, was a moral philosopher. And moral philosophy, there was a moral philosophic aspect of the Enlightenment, self-government, anti-monarchical, and related notions. But there was also great ferment in astronomy, botany, chemistry. It was just a very vibrant time. Jefferson was interested in exploration. Cook did exploration. Nobody did exploration better than Captain Cook. That is the Jefferson-Cook nexus.
And there are 2 other connections which we might just briefly mention. One is that Jefferson was to America what Joseph Banks was in many respects to Britain, and one of the Americans who was on the 3rd and final voyage of Captain Cook was an eccentric named John Ledyard, who was a pal of Jefferson's, and in Paris they cooked up an even wilder global exploration scheme. And then finally Lewis, on his famous journal entry on departure from Fort Mandan on April 7th, 1805, explicitly links himself to 2 great previous explorers, Columbus and Captain Cook. So there is a strong Jefferson-Cook connection, isn't there?
Absolutely. Ledyard got the idea, itself a legendary notion, of walking around the world. He was inspired by Captain Cook's global outlook. And when Cook on the 3rd voyage sailed and actually defined for the first time the juxtaposition of the far east Cape of Asia with the westernmost point of North America, Cape Prince of Wales, I suspect and argue in subsequent writing that Ledyard thereupon, at that moment, got the idea, or shortly thereafter. Cook might have been able to sail around the world and circumnavigated it 3 times, but Ledyard conjured up the idea of walking around the world. Once he realized that Asia and North America were only about 40 miles apart at their narrowest point, he got the idea of traveling around the world in that means, and actually propositioned in a fashion Jefferson to sponsor that. Jefferson was very much intrigued. That idea was abortive. The Empress kicked Ledyard out of Russia when he was really 7/8 of the way across Eurasia. And then he got caught up in the quest for continental interiors and was on his way to search for the headwaters of the Niger. The last person John Ledyard ever corresponded with was Thomas Jefferson.
Thank you. We're talking to David Nicandri, our Enlightenment correspondent from Washington State, formerly the executive director of the Washington State Historical Society, the author of a celebrated book on Lewis and Clark called River of Promise, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia. And now I'm holding in my hands his 434-page study of Captain Cook entitled Captain Cook Rediscovered, Voyaging to the Icy Latitudes. David?
There are, I'm certain, a number of listeners of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I mean, everyone has heard of Captain Cook, but I'm certain there are a number of listeners that don't really know a lot about him. So I'll pose the question, had there been no Captain Cook, what would we have lost, Mr. Nicandri?
Oh, gosh, it's hard to, it's like asking what would American history be like if there were no Thomas Jefferson, and I'm not trying to be theatrical in saying that. Cook's geographic accomplishments are just simply astounding. Near the end of the book is actually the first modern map of the world. Cook traveled so many miles, and actually his signal contribution to world geography, the geographic comprehension of the world, was the proper distancing of the Pacific Ocean and how it was bordered by land masses on the east and the west. And if you look at the map that was done at the end, it was published in Cook's third voyage account, 1784. It is truly the first modern map of the world. So when you say, what would we have lost? Thomas Jefferson would have had literally no roadmap, no way of comprehending where North America was in the world. So the first modern map of the world, the ordering of the continents, the spatial capacity of the Pacific Basin in particular, was a contribution of Cook's. But what I try to do in this book, David, and I think of it as kind of its novel contribution, is that Cook is inevitably thought of as a tropical explorer. The voyage to Tahiti was famous. He died in Hawaii. But in fact, Cook was a polar explorer of the first rank. And even above and beyond that, in an age where global warming is of paramount concern, the recession of the polar ice packs likely to dominate 21st century life across the world, Cook was a pioneering polar hydrologist. And he invented modern sea ice science. It's hard to believe, but in Cook's time, people did not think that salt water froze. People did not believe that at serious depth, salt water did not freeze. And on his second voyage, Cook, because he was crisscrossing the Indian, Pacific, Atlantic Ocean, he concluded there's no land here from which the ice we see could have emanated. That is to say, salt water itself had to freeze. And of course it does. And he was the first to describe and characterize glacial calving. So all of the icebergs that populate the southern oceans, Cook deduced, had to come from those few places he visited. And it was on that basis that he said there has to be a continent at the South Pole to populate the southern oceans with all the icebergs and ice we see. That is what we learned from Captain Cook's second and third voyages.
So the answer, to be short, is what would we have lost without Cook? A lot. And at this point, gentlemen, we need to take a short break.
We're talking to our good friend, David Nicandri of Washington State, formerly the executive director of the Washington State Historical Society, now the author of a couple of extraordinary books, a third on the way and a fourth in the works. Captain Cook Rediscovered, Voyaging to the Icy Latitudes, published just now by the University of British Columbia Press. We'll be back in a moment to continue this conversation with our Enlightenment correspondent, Dave Nicandri.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, our conversation with the author David Nicandri about his new book on Captain Cook. And one thing the two of you touched on that I found fascinating was Cook's influence on the Enlightenment.
The whole point of the Enlightenment, this gets back to the first voyage, doesn't it, Professor Nicandri, that Cook was sent by Great Britain to observe this phenomenon known as the transit of Venus from Tahiti. And the reason he was sent there was you need to get your observation points far away from each other so that you can use geometrical triangulation to determine the distance of the sun from the earth and so on and so forth. So he went to Tahiti in a deliberate project of the Enlightenment. And tell us how important that is to our understanding of him and his reputation in history, Dave.
Cook's first voyage is privileged in the literature of Cook. The novelty of the first voyage, of course, the pure exoticism from the European perspective of the Tahitian landscape, its people, the scientific point of the voyage, because astronomy and botany were the premier Enlightenment sciences. And the first voyage centralized both astronomy, viewing the transit of Venus, which was a very complicated, the parallax calculation, which is far more intricate. I can't begin to explain the mathematics of it. And the transit voyage to Tahiti was taking the trigonometry, the triangulation of landscapes, and applying it on a cosmic scale. You establish a baseline between Greenwich and Tahiti, and you replicate that with numerous other triangles all over the world, and you measure how long it takes Venus to pass across the face of the sun's face. And through this calculation, one can determine the distance of the sun to the earth, how far Venus is from Earth. So the astronomy was central. So Cook's first voyage became privileged, but I argue in my book, Cook was actually his ablest as a cartographer and as a navigator on the third voyage. He was at his best. He coincidentally happened to get killed on the third. That has flavored posterity's judgment of that voyage, but unfairly in my view.
All right, so I'm holding the book in my hands, Dave, and by the way, it's a beautifully produced book, a splendid cover. The typography is great. It's printed on fine paper. You have every reason to be just thrilled with it as book as book. And I'm looking at your first page in your introduction, and I want to read what you rightly say is maybe the most famous sentence by any explorer in human history. Here it comes. I'm quoting directly from Captain James Cook. "I, whose ambition leads me not only farther than any other man has been before me, but as far I think it possible for man to go, was not sorry at meeting with this interruption, as it in some measure relieved us from the dangers and hardships inseparable with the navigation of the southern polar regions." Anyone who knows their Star Trek knows that line, Dave.
Yes, absolutely. It served as the inspiration for Gene Roddenberry, wherein the voice of Captain Kirk, the crew of the Enterprise, is voyaging as far as man can possibly go. And as I also argue there in the opening pages of the book, I also think Cook's text there inspired Neil Armstrong's, because one of the curious aspects of the way Cook phrased that text, Clay, and I'm curious whether you agree or not, he doesn't say as far as a man, he says as far as man can go. And people often wonder, did Neil Armstrong misspeak when he set foot on the face of the moon by leaving out a word as far as man or as far as a man, great step for man or leap for man, etc. And so I think not only was Gene Roddenberry inspired by Cook's text, I think Neil Armstrong was as well.
So let's go to the key concept here. So you've already said that that most people who know something about Captain James Cook remember him primarily for the tropical zone and Tahiti and Hawaii and so on. And of course, his death sucks up a lot of the oxygen in all studies of Captain James Cook. You're saying that that's in some ways a historiographical mistake because it gives too much weight to that part of what he did and not enough to the more extraordinary achievement of his almost spectacular capacity for mapping and navigation and his search in the high latitudes, by which we mean towards the North Pole and towards the South Pole. And in the third voyage, which you concentrate on in this book, you're saying that he was not worn out, worn down, lost his esprit de corps, didn't really have the right stuff anymore, and therefore blundered and eventually got himself killed. You're saying that is a fundamental misreading of the third voyage.
That's absolutely correct, Clay. So I think you've captured the essence of it. So regarding the privileging of the first voyage, my analogy is that a phenomenon I think any family with multiple children in it can relate to. Now, you and I can, as with our sibling, that we happen to be the parents of only childs, but there's a well-known phenomenon that the first child has more pictures in the family album than all the subsequent children. That's my analogy for what's happened with Cook. Because of its novelty and the Tahitian connection, it gets privileged. But in fact, Cook reached the apex of his accomplishments on the second and the third voyage. On the second, by vacating the southern hemisphere of the analog to Eurasia, and his breakthrough on polar glaciology, and on the third, by the constant rigor, the grittiness he brought to the task at hand. My favorite way of telling that story in the third voyage is by recounting his exploration of Norton Sound on the west coast of Alaska. Now, in the larger body of Cook literature, Norton Sound in Alaska is kind of a backwater. Not a lot of attention is given to it. But I saw his devotion to trying to figure out every possible means of getting above North America through the northern ice pack. His diligence. I mean, he had worn out everyone else's patience that was voyaging with him. Here's the irony. The trope of the third voyage, the tired third voyage explorer, is belied by the Norton Sound experience. Everyone else got tired of exploring before Captain Cook did. And you can see that in his exploration of Norton Sound. And then on the second voyage, Cook he'd head south as far as he could. He'd hit the ice pack. It would thwart any further south. He'd go north to get to the warmer climate. He'd come south again, hit the ice again. So he would bounce back and forth off of the southern Antarctic ice pack. But on the third voyage, and I call those needle nose-like approaches to the southern ice pack during his circumnavigation of Antarctica. However, on the third voyage, looking for the Northwest Passage, Cook sailed almost 20 degrees of longitude parallel to the Arctic ice pack, looking for a passage through or around so he could get to Baffin Bay and prove that a Northwest Passage existed. He did this 6 to 8 months before he was killed in Hawaii, followed later by his Norton Sound mapping to see if he had missed another way to get east through the North American continent. So the guy was just ineffable. He was indefatigable. And that's why the tired voyager hypothesis, which as I denominate it here in this book, is such a historiographic travesty, because there's nothing in his conduct, his execution of the third voyage, to lead one to think that the man was a tired, worn-out explorer.
I have a couple of questions that come from this. First of all, just an observation. When our northern boundary is the 49th parallel, and of course I live in North Dakota, and so does David Swenson. This is a cold subarctic climate here with long and often brutal winters. The Arctic Circle is at 66 and 2/3. That's a long, long, long way north of the boundary between Canada and the United States. But here's my point, Dave. When you get there, you still have what can only be called an immense distance, a hell of a long way to the pole.
Yes, yes, that's of course true, Clay, and that brings to mind one of my major revisions or attempted revisions to Cook historiography, because in a Cook framework, Clay, if you think about it, the 49th parallel or the 47th, where I literally live right on the 47th parallel, we think of that as a reasonably high latitude, but it's only, they're barely more than halfway to the North Pole. And so what this brings to mind in terms of my revisionistic outlook is that historians of the Pacific Northwest, for as long as I can remember, and I've worked in the field out here since 1972, there's a regional version of the tired voyager hypothesis, which coheres around the notion that Captain Cook missed the Columbia River and failed to explore the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which is a few degrees north. The Columbia River is at 46 degrees north. The Strait of Juan de Fuca is at 48 degrees north. Well, there was no point to Cook exploring in these latitudes. He was coasting North America, the Pacific slope, but other explorers, including famously Samuel Hearne, who was a Hudson Bay Company explorer, he had traveled northwest from Churchill on Hudson Bay and had reached the Arctic Ocean at 70 degrees north, looking for the Northwest Passage. He did not find one. None of the Indians he talked to knew of any water, salt water, or in those latitudes. Hearne's findings from his voyage of 1771-72 were relayed to the British Admiralty on the eve of Cook's third voyage. And so there was no point to Cook exploring in these rather southerly latitudes, because as Hearne had proved, if there was a Northwest Passage, it could only be at about 70 degrees north. And that is why, and I emphasize this probably in a belabored sense in my book, but I keep going back to the mission, Clay, which is a concept I learned from you in my study of Meriwether Lewis. The mission is all. And Cook's mission was not to begin looking for a Northwest Passage until he got to 65 degrees north. And so if there was a river at 46, or if there was an inlet at 48, that didn't matter. The mission was at 65 degrees north.
Mr. Nicandri, if I can pull you back from Captain Cook for a moment to yourself, I'm very curious as to how this idea of writing on Captain Cook came about, what your master plan was, and particularly how you researched.
Well, I appreciate that question, David. If I can reflect on myself for a second, I think, and Clay can be an external validator of this, I think of myself as somewhat of an iconoclast. I've always loved revisionist history. I remember in school, as an undergraduate and grad school, reading the great revisionists, Charles Beard, Vernon Parrington, and the others. And so I always liked the idea of looking at history from a different vantage point. I had an idea late in the previous decade, about the time I was finishing the Lewis and Clark book, when there was increased awareness and realization of the impact of global warming and the recession of the Arctic ice pack, that golly, if Captain Cook were to sail now, he actually could have gotten through. And of course, that is true. There are transits of the Northwest Passage made, I mean, they're not simple to do, but they're done routinely in this day and age because the ice has receded to such an extent. And I thought, that's a timely way of approaching a topic that almost universally is viewed from the vantage of the tropics. So I began reading the journals, reading the secondary literature as well. That's how you form a hypothesis. And I quickly came upon, I think, to get to the heart of your question, David, what to me was kind of the personal revelation. And that was this, that historians had been overly generous to Meriwether Lewis, but when it came to James Cook, they had been overly critical. So that was kind of my motivating hypothesis and sentiment. So that's how I got the idea, and that's how I pursued it.
Something else that came up earlier in the conversation was Jefferson's debt to Cook. Can you talk about that?
Yes, this is a little known aspect. Cook was it's probably hard to really get a sense of how famous a person Cook was in his time. I mean, I think Neil Armstrong might have approached it, but I don't think completely. Clay, I'd appreciate your perspective on that. But Cook's account, the published accounts of Cook's voyages, David, almost literally created a subgenre of nonfiction literature.
Interesting.
The illustrated scientific travel account. And since we're talking about the Enlightenment, Thomas Jefferson would have been one of the more avid readers of all three of those. And I maintain, and I document elsewhere, but I think I touch upon it in this book as well. Jefferson was inspired in the particulars of his instructions to Meriwether Lewis by what he saw in the official published accounts of Cook's voyages, where Cook's instructions were outlined in detail. Now, of course, the particulars would have varied. Lewis and Clark, or Lewis, and since that was Jefferson's guy, he was going to explore different part of the globe than Cook was. But the scientific methodology was precisely overlain one from the other. Recording important places, observing the face of the land, the instructions on how to deal with indigenous peoples. So Jefferson drew in whole cloth from what he saw published in the Admiralty accounts of Cook's voyages. And then at another level, David, even goes beyond that. Because after Cook's demise, one of the memorialists to his memory referred to Cook's courage undaunted. Now that phrase should probably ring a bell with listeners to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Yes.
Because Jefferson used the very same phrase in his memorial to Lewis in the Biddle edition of the Lewis and Clark journals when they came out. Jefferson referred to Lewis's courage undaunted, whole cloth, right out of the literature of Cook. And of course, Stephen Ambrose famously interpolated that phrase to create the title for Undaunted Courage, still the most famous and popular book about the Lewis and Clark expedition ever written. So in that sense, even Stephen Ambrose is in debt to Captain Cook, or at least Captain Cook's legacy.
That's great. Gentlemen, we need to take just a short break. We'll return to this conversation with our special guest, the author David Nicandri, in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back, everyone. This is Clay Jenkinson, out of character this week, talking with our dear friend, our West Coast Enlightenment correspondent, David Nicandri, author of the just published new and splendid book, Captain Cook Rediscovered, Voyaging to the Icy Latitudes. A couple of things. You talked about Neil Armstrong's fame and, trying how can we measure or appreciate the place of Cook in the 18th century mind. And I think Neil Armstrong certainly became a world-famous person, but he did not capture the imagination of the people in the way that Cook did. Of course, it was a very different age, and Armstrong's achievement was at the apex of a vast technological system, whereas Cook was really more or less that lonely wanderer out in the seas. But maybe a better analogy, Dave Nicandri, is Lindbergh. Even though Lindbergh merely did a feat, he ignited world imagination when he crossed the Atlantic. I don't think we have an adequate analogy in our time. But here's what strikes me as so interesting about Cook: that as late as Columbus, so 1492, certainly we knew almost nothing about anything beyond the Azores, and suddenly Columbus opens up literally a new world. But from a global perspective, the Western Hemisphere is just a sort of parenthesis interrupting that voyage. If he had really attempted to sail around the world, he would have found the sheer, almost infinite immensity of the Pacific. But even in the time of, say, the early 18th century, Europeans had a very shadowy, mysterious understanding of what was out there. They thought maybe there was a southern continent that would be a geographical counterpoise to Eurasia, and they had just an enormous amount of uncertainty about where things were and how many islands there were and how many archipelagos there were and so on. And so Cook almost single-handedly fills in the gaps in our global knowledge. Of course, he didn't exhaust it, but he filled in the main lines of it, didn't he? And in doing so, he gave the world for the first time something like real understanding of how the continental system of the planet is laid out.
That's very well stated, Clay. And I love the Lindbergh analogy. I think that works as well, and maybe better than Armstrong. But when I mentioned earlier that the composite map completed at the end of Cook's third voyage is the first modern map of the world, I would encourage anyone, if I'm privileged to have people buy the book and look at that map, and then look at any modern Mercator projection of the globe. And you will, I mean, there are some anomalies. I mean, Alaska's a little too big. The Korean Peninsula is kind of ill-formed. Japan's not quite right. But you look at that map at a glance, and that looks like a modern map of the Earth's surface. But you look at maps even done 10, 15 years before Cook. I mean, they're filled with sea serpents and angelic figures and the imaginary continents. And it's just astonishing the precision that Cook and his voyages wrought in terms of Enlightenment era civilizations' conception of what the Earth and the land masses and the oceans looked like. But there's another analogy that I think figures in Cook, because a colleague in historiography, Felipe Fernandez Armesto, popularized a great trope when he talked about dying prematurely as a great career move. And of course, that applies to Meriwether Lewis. It also applies to Captain Cook. That kind of turbocharges the allure of historiographic figures. But there's another analogy to the modern era that looms in terms of Cook's demise, and I talk about it near the end of the book. When news finally reached Great Britain that Cook had died, the news that Cook had died was an absolutely shocking event. A contemporary of Cook's referred to it as a loss to the cosmos. The King of England, King George III, sobbed when he heard the news. And by analogy, I say in the book, nothing as shocking happened to the Western world compared to the death of Captain Cook until the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963. That was the stature and the place in the world's imagination that James Cook filled.
Excellent. We're talking about the new book, Captain Cook Rediscovered, Voyaging to the Icy Latitudes by David L. Nicandri. Now, let me just say a couple things about you as a writer that I think will interest our many listeners and your admirers. One is what you just did. You travel out of the historiography frequently to try to telescope way back and search for the analogy, to search for the way of putting it in perspective, to place it in a larger context so that it becomes accessible to the reader. And so that analogy that nothing so cataclysmic occurred in global understanding until the death of John Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963. I can see a historian quibbling with you, but we get what you're trying to do, which is to say, how do you assess the death and the apotheosis of a person like James Cook? So that's one thing that I greatly admire about your work. There's an imaginative and creative boldness that probably an academic supervisor at Yale or the University of Washington would try to knock out of you at some point, but it actually makes, I think, for a particular one of your talents. Here's the other one. You said, some people might think that I'm kind of modestly an iconoclast. Are you nuts? You are an iconoclast.
Well, that's very kind, Clay. But I want to say two things, I guess, by way of response. A friend of ours in common, James Rhonda, once wrote something that has just stuck with me all through the years in my writing. You may remember this line when he talks about the problem with the Lewis and Clark story, which of course was the context within which I discovered Rhonda's thinking. Is the problem with the Lewis and Clark story is that it's been told so often that all the rough edges have been rounded off. And I guess if there's a way of describing what I do, it's trying to rough up the edges of the stories once again. I'm not trying to be controversial for controversy's sake, but there are just different ways of looking at things if one takes the time. And there's another thing I'd like to say, Clay. I wouldn't be a writer but for the encouragement you've given me. And I want the listeners of the Thomas Jefferson Hour to know the debt I owe to you.
Oh my! I can't tell you how moving it is to me to have you say that, and I'll even assume that it's partly true. Let's go back to the thesis of the book one more time. Mission, mission, mission. In one sentence, what was the mission of the third voyage?
Was to determine if there was a shortcut from the Atlantic Basin to the far East Asian mainland or the Spice Islands of the East Indies by approaching it from the Pacific shore, because 3 centuries worth of attempts at finding this passage from Hudson Bay and Baffin Bay had proved fruitless.
So that was the purpose of the third and final voyage. And of course, from the point of view of mission accomplished, you could say he failed because there then was no such Northwest Passage. But of course, a scientific endeavor like this never fails because he added an enormous amount of really important data to our understanding of the Pacific Northwest.
That's true, but here's where my iconoclasm comes to the fore, I guess. Because the truth of the matter is, Clay, the transit of Venus observation failed. The second voyage's mission failed. There was no parallel or analog to Eurasia in the southern hemisphere, and there was at that time no Northwest Passage, though there is now. My point being, Cook's failures on the first 2 voyages, I use failures in quotes, are kind of written off as just kind of, well, that's just simply the way it was. But the failure on the third, because he happens to die on the third voyage, has created this jaundiced view of his final expedition, and tragically so, in my opinion, because I really do think, completely contrary to the orthodox understanding of Cook historiography, the third voyage of Cook's was his greatest, notwithstanding the fact that he died on it. As I point out at numerous instances in the book, Clay, I mean, normally what happens in Cook historiography is that historians look at the third voyage through the gauzy lens of the first and second. I've turned that on its head, as I suppose an iconoclast would do, and I've looked at the first 2 voyages from the vantage point of the third. And just to give one instance, Cook was killed on the third voyage. But there are at least half a dozen instances on the first and second voyage when Cook could have been killed in exactly the same scenarios that ultimately eventuated, but didn't because he bowed out of the way of a spear or the rock didn't hit him in the head. And so Cook just simply tempted fate. In fact, one of the more telling comments about Cook's death, when again news reached London in January in 1780, one of the first published comments by someone who seems to have traveled with Cook, went along to these lines: "It's not surprising that Cook was killed on this voyage. The wonder is that he hadn't been killed on the first 2.
We're speaking with the author David L. Nicandri. His new book, Captain Cook Rediscovered, Voyaging to the Icy Latitudes. It would appear, David, that the official release date is November 14th of 2020. So now that this book is out, do you sit back and bask in its glory, or do you have plans for more work?
Well, it certainly is rewarding, as Clay has attested many times on the show. It's a great moment to get the book in hand. This took me 9 years to get this done. The first Lewis and Clark took 10, and even then, because Clay kind of rescued me. But I've got the sequel to this book, Discovering Nothing. And actually, David, you'll recall my trip to the Arctic with my son.
Yes, sir.
You seem to have enjoyed that.
Very much.
My recounting of that. I'm just about finished the research phase of what I'll call the 4th book in this sequence. It's called Driving to the Arctic, the Northwest and other passages. And I get into some exploration, some other people we haven't talked about much, Sir John Franklin, Sir John Richardson, George M. Dawson, after whom Dawson City in the Yukon is named. But I'm trying to do something new in this fourth book, which is to get a little more personal. There's aspects of a travelogue, which I've never attempted. So I'm trying to expand my repertoire a little bit. We'll see if I can pull that off.
Well, I hope so, and I certainly hope that it isn't 10 years between this book and your next.
I have a couple of quick questions for you, David. First of all, you talk about the tired Cook hypothesis. Is there any way in which that shapes our thinking of the tired Lewis hypothesis?
Oh, absolutely, Clay. There's a lot of borrowing from one literature to the other. In fact, someone we know mutually or know the work of, Thomas Slaughter, his somewhat famous book, Exploring Lewis and Clark, well, first of all, he owes a great deal to you because he used some of your best ideas and amplified on them. But what Slaughter did, which I now realized once I got into the literature of Cook, is that he borrowed all of those postmodernist, post-colonial tropes that had been applied to Cook historiography since the 1960s and began to apply them to the literature of Lewis and Clark. So yeah, there's a lot of crossbreeding there, which as it should be, Clay. I mean, that was Jim Ronda's great insight, which is that one of the misfortunes of Lewis and Clark historiography is that it had been studied in isolation, and it becomes richer, more rough-edged, again, to go back to my concept, when you explore it in parallel circumstances with other explorers, as we've talked about previously with Alexander Mackenzie, or here in today's conversation with Captain Cook.
Yeah, let me ask one last question, and then we'll have to let it go for now. I do highly recommend this book, Captain Cook Rediscovered, Voyaging to the Icy Latitudes. This is what I regard as sort of a tragic irony. You've said several times it is now possible to do the Northwest Passage from either direction because of global warming and because of the recension, the pulling back of the polar ice sheet. So it would be possible to do this today. This was one of the quests of humankind for literally hundreds, even thousands of years. And now to see that it's finally possible because humans have damaged the biosphere to the point where we really have to wonder about the future. There's kind of a strange, fascinating, tragic irony there, isn't there?
Yes, there is, Clay, and I completely agree. One of the axioms of Orthodox Cook historiography is that Cook founded the maritime fur trade with the sea otter pelts. It said actually Cook he was completely dismissive of the fur trade. It was people who sailed with Cook and discovered the value of the sea otter pelts in China after Cook was dead that actually popularized and promoted the idea of the maritime fur trade. My point being that in Cook's wake, there was a rush to the Northwest coast. And of course, that's the phenomenon of which the Lewis and Clark expedition is a part. But above and beyond that, to the global warming nexus, because with the recession of both polar packs, but in regard to the northern one now here in particular, there is now a rush to the Arctic. The Arctic powers are militarizing their northern coastlines. The Chinese are building a fleet of icebreakers. Russia is militarizing its north coast. Canada is becoming more interested. So the 21st century, in geopolitical terms, the Arctic is going to loom quite large in the next few decades of human history. Yet one more reason to study the career of a man who first outlined and created a benchmark for its key properties, both in terms of ice science, but also the native species of the North. including walruses and polar bears.
Thank you, David L. Nicandri, whose new book, Captain Cook Rediscovered Voyaging to the Icy Latitudes, has been the subject of today's Jefferson Hour. All I can say, Dave Nicandri, is that if anyone out there is a gazillionaire and wants to send the two of us through the Northwest Passage, we are tan, ready, and rested. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.